Most are considering UCLA to be the best two-loss team in college football. They have the highest ranking of those teams right now in the college football playoff rankings, and more importantly, have a Pac-12 championship on the line when they take on the Stanford Cardinal coming up this Saturday. We bring in Mike W.R. of Gojo Bruin to talk it up, and let's look at the Bruins taking on the Cardinal. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, this is always a good time to talk about the Bruins, and has to be a good time for you talking about winning Bruin football. And it doesn't get much better than taking on your arch rival and dominating a game where most people really felt as though that was an evenly matched game. And I went on the record as saying the only reason I was picking UCLA was that the game was at the Rose Bowl, and Brett Hundley is a dynamic quarterback that can make plays with his legs. Otherwise, I couldn't distinguish between these two teams. But as it played out, UCLA was the much more physically dominant team.
Yeah, it seemed that UCLA was a little bit more prepared. One of the big knocks against Steve Sarkisian, especially when he got hired, a lot of grumblings about what went on from the USC camps, but the biggest thing is that Sarkisian has not really been known to finish big games and to close out. And sure enough, we saw it here. UCLA started off pretty strong, and USC had some good chances, but overall the play calling seemed weak. Tackling was atrocious on the part of the Trojans, and the Bruins just dominated, especially their defense, which has just come into its own lately. They led behind Eric Kendricks, who had that big interception that basically changed the direction of the game. Kind of let the air out of USC's sails. It just, things were clicking on all cylinders. I mean, it started off a little awkwardly with Hundley throwing that pick six on the first drive. And you heard it from the USC section in the Rose Bowl, but the Bruins came back. They scored 2 touchdowns. USC tied it, but after that, I think it was 24 straight points that UCLA scored, and they just dominated USC on all fronts. UCLA's offensive line allowed the running game to do what they do. Hundley was passing the ball everywhere. One thing about UCLA's offense is that when Hundley passes the ball around to about 7, 8, 9, 10 receivers, that's when they do really well. And that's what happened here. 10 receivers got their hands on the ball, and they just kept USC guessing. But the biggest surprise was the pass rush. It was fantastic. It has not been UCLA's strong suit on defense, but all of a sudden, 6 sacks, and they basically had USC's offense where they wanted them. USC has a young offensive line, and they're going to do better, but they just were no match against UCLA's defensive line. Cody Kessler was running around the field, running for his life basically, and was getting no help from the front. So UCLA was able to dominate both lines basically, and there you have it, a 38-20 win.
Mike, with this college football playoff system in place, it seems to be talked about more now than it ever has been before with these college football teams about kind of the storyline of the season. When were they good? When were they down? They're a different team today than they were in September, and kind of trying to track that. And we've got a UCLA team that was kind of the chic pick nationally to make it to the playoffs at the outset of the season, stumbled out of the gate, didn't lose games, but barely made it past to Memphis and to Texas. And then they stumbled through a couple losses. They didn't look that great against Cal and against Colorado, but then they really showed up against Arizona State, a very talented, fast team. And now this performance against USC has to be the high point of the season. And now this UCLA team comes into Stanford, the Stanford game, and it's given respect as most likely the best two-loss team in college football.
Yeah, definitely. After the college football playoff rankings came out on yesterday, a lot of UCLA fans on Twitter were saying how UCLA is better than BYU and TCU and Baylor, specifically the two teams that are before them, and they have one loss. Well, the thing is, UCLA, they did lose 2 games. One they should have won against Utah, and another that they just kind of imploded against Oregon. So those 2 losses hurt, and obviously at that time dropped them down. So UCLA has kind of they've had to fight back into this spot. Now, after those two losses, nobody really expected them to compete for the college football playoffs. It was thought that their hopes for making the first playoffs was over, but as you said, they had dominating performances, especially in the last three games. Especially it's Arizona, Washington, and USC. They just seem to put it together. Now, I've noticed both defense and offense have been actually really good all year long. They just haven't been consistent, and they haven't been good in certain games. There was one during Memphis, the Memphis game. The offense was good and the defense was horrible. The first game of the season against Virginia, UCLA's offense wasn't clicking, but the defense had 3 interceptions, was basically won the game for them. And so it's been this inconsistency, and especially with penalties and turnovers and just mistakes galore in the middle of the season, really had UCLA struggling. But since in the last 3 games, they've seemed to pull it together and just play some complete games, and now we're seeing that team that everybody hoped that would emerge at the beginning of the season. Unfortunately, it took a little bit longer than everyone expected, but right now UCLA is just clicking on all cylinders, and it's a very important game right now because 2 weeks ago when Arizona State lost to Oregon State, that put that gave UCLA their own destiny. What is the phrase I'm looking for? I'm sorry. They control their own destiny, basically. And basically, UCLA had to win 2 games. They completed the first one, beating USC, and now if they beat Stanford, they booked their ticket to the Pac-12 championship game against Oregon, who they clinched the North Division weeks ago. So they're a tough team, and UCLA lost horribly to Oregon. So looking ahead, I don't want to look ahead, but that would be a game that UCLA would definitely be ready for and a chance to have some payback against Oregon. But first things first, they need to take care of Stanford, who they have not beaten in 6 years. They're 0-3 in the Jim Mora era. They came close 2 years ago in the Pac-12 championship game against Stanford and lost by a field goal. But then, and then last year you had the Bruin Revolution, and going into Stanford, it seemed like there was a lot behind UCLA. But then they got stomped. They didn't score a touchdown until the fourth quarter and just got wrecked by Stanford. This year it's different because Stanford is having a bit of a down season, and UCLA is they're one step away from the Pac-12 championship game. That doesn't mean that UCLA is going to roll over Stanford, because Stanford, you just never want to second guess that team, especially their defense, who is just solid. Their defense is number 1 in every defensive statistic in the Pac-12, but their offense is last not last. They're toward the bottom of every statistical category in the Pac-12. Now, that doesn't mean that they're a horrible offensive team, because they play a certain pace, a certain style of football that's grind it out, slow it down. So that's a little bit skewed, but at the same time, you see the games that they've won and lost, and against Oregon, Stanford just got beat. Stanford was averaging just over 100 yards. They were allowing just over 100 yards on the ground per game. Against Oregon, they gave up 267. So, it's up and down for Stanford, but it does not mean that they're a team to be looked past.
Yeah, over the past 5 or 6 years, Oregon and Stanford have dominated the conference. Now, physically, Stanford's dominated the conference with a much different brand of football, as we well know. They're still playing that brand of football, and as you mentioned, defensively, they're just about as strong. I'm not going to say quite as strong as they have been the past couple of years, but statistics would show that they're just about as good as they are, not scoring enough points to win games, losing a lot of close games, excluding that Oregon game at 6-5. So this has been a Stanford team that you mentioned UCLA not being able to beat, because Stanford's been such a physically strong football team. But UCLA seems to have gotten to a point that they're now a team that goes out and dominates teams physically too.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said before, their defensive line has just emerged. Their linebackers have been solid all year long behind Miles Jack and Eric Kendricks. Their secondary took on a lot of pressure earlier in the season and had to almost make up for what the defensive line was lacking. Although now UCLA has a better pass rush. They have this one guy that they picked up midseason, Takros McKinley, who's just astounding. What he's doing, joining a Division I school midway through, coming from a JC, it's fantastic, and it's allowing other defensive linemen to work freely. Owa Odigizua is coming into his own. Who's it? Ellis McCarthy, Eddie Vanderdoes. They're just dominating right now, and what that's doing is relieving pressure for the other position groups, and it's just clicking. And like we saw against USC, with a great pass rush, they weren't able to do anything. Cody Kessler couldn't pass the ball. They couldn't get their run game. They held Buck Allen, who formerly was the leading rusher in the Pac-12, to only 60 yards a game in that game. So it's almost eye-opening to see what they're doing, but at the same time, they've been there. This defense has been there. They just needed a few few things to kind of get them going, and it just seems that the hype going into the postseason, is helping out with that. But at the same time, defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, he seemed to own that game, that and Washington the last couple of games. He was just on fire with the defense, and I think that with Stanford's offense being a little less than it has been in past years, that they're going to be able to stop Stanford from scoring. Now, Stanford's defense, that's a toss-up about what they're going to do. Can Brett Hundley, being a dual-threat quarterback, having Paul Perkins, who is now the leading rusher in the Pac-12, will they run all over Stanford? Can Hundley pass the ball around again and confuse Stanford? That's going to be the interesting part of this game. So regardless of Stanford is down this year, they're not out, and they are still going to give UCLA one heck of a game.
Mike W.R. joins us from GoJoBruin.com. Check out his work there. He writes some extremely insightful stuff when it comes to UCLA football, with the Bruins on the brink of a Pac-12 championship meeting with Oregon, if they can get by the Stanford Cardinal and defeat the Cardinal for the first time in 6 seasons, and set up what we anticipate to be an exciting rematch with the Oregon Ducks, and test the theory that possibly a Pac-12 two-loss champion could make the college football playoff. Hey, Mike, we appreciate the time and the insight.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for having me again.